They called her the Salt Widow, not because her husband drowned, but because no one could remember if he ever existed at all. Her name was Eloise Thorne. She lived in the last house on Driftmouth Cliffs, a leaning black structure with green-tinged windows and rusted bells hanging from its eaves. The sea crashed endlessly below. Nothing grew in her garden but nettles and gray moss. Children who passed her fence held their breath. Dogs refused to enter her yard. And yet, she smiled. She always smiled. Even when the salt wind made her eyes bleed. Even when she buried another jar in the sand. The jars were the first thing Iris noticed. Iris Camber, 29, daughter of a drowned sailor, granddaughter of a disappeared lighthouse keeper, and recently returned to Driftmouth after 20 years away. Her return was meant to be temporary, to sign papers, to close her late aunt's estate, to say goodbye to a coastline that had always whispered at her dreams. But then she saw the Salt Widow on the beach at dawn, wearing black lace, and digging, with bare hands, and burying a jar. Iris didn't speak to her. Not then. She watched from the dunes. The jar was glass, sealed with wax. Something swirled inside, too dark to be water, too thick to be sand. The widow placed it in the pit gently, like tucking in a child. Then she spoke aloud, 3 words. The wind drowned them out. But the sea paused. Just once. As if it heard her. That night, Iris dreamed of a house with wet windows and long hallways made of bone. And a voice behind a door she could not open. If you break the wax, you must remember the name. She woke to the sound of bells. Not from a church. From the cliffs. The next morning, she found a jar on her doorstep. Identical to the one she saw buried. Wax sealed. Cool to the touch. Inside, a lock of hair floating in brine, tied with a green thread, and scratched into the bottom of the glass. For what was taken? She brought it to the town archivist, old Miss Betley, who hadn't left the records room in 6 years. When she saw the jar, her lips went white. You shouldn't have touched this. What is it? An offering, or a promise, depending on how it was buried. Who is the Salt Widow? Betley didn't blink, only whispered. She was the sea's once, and the sea never lets go of what it's tasted. That evening, Iris walked the beach again. The widow was already there, standing in the tide, dress soaked, head tilted like listening to something below the surface. Iris approached slowly. "Why did you leave this for me?" she asked. The widow didn't turn, only said, "The cliffs remember. You left something here. I was a child. All the more reason." The sea hissed. The wind pulled at Iris's coat. "What's in the jar?" The widow finally turned. Her eyes were not blind, but looked beyond, into something Iris could not see. She said, "It's a name, but not yours." That night, the jar cracked. Not broken, just a thin fracture along the seal. And Iris heard the ocean inside it. Not water. Voices. Low, layered, humming in a language that might have been her own name repeated backward. She set it down. But her fingers smelled like salt and blood. At 2:17 a.m., the house shifted. Not a quake. Just tilted. As if something beneath it moved. The walls dripped condensation. The pipes groaned. And from under the floorboards, a second jar rolled out. No label. Only a fingernail pressed flat against the glass. Iris screamed. Left the house. Ran barefoot to the cliffs. To the Salt Widow's door. She didn't knock. She didn't have to. It opened before her hand reached it. Inside, candlelight. Nets on the ceiling. Walls hung with wet photographs that dripped quietly. And in the center of the room, a table. With 7 jars. Each labeled with a name Iris didn't recognize. Except one. Her father's. She stepped back. "No," she whispered. The widow nodded once. "You opened it." "I didn't." "You dreamed of it." "That's enough." I don't understand. The widow reached into her coat, pulled out a knife made of coral. Then it's time to listen to the sea when it speaks your name. The knife was unlike any Iris had ever seen. Not metal, but living coral, fossilized mid-scream. Its hilt coiled with barnacles. Tiny white eyes blinked in the grooves. The salt widow set it down beside the jar bearing her father's name. Neither invitation nor threat. Only expectation. Why is his name here? Iris asked. The widow didn't answer at once. She lit a long black taper and passed it across the mouths of the other jars. Each one hissed. The brine inside shimmered. And for a moment, the room tipped, just like her house had. As if the floorboards floated on something far deeper than land. You were told he drowned, the widow finally said. I was 6. You still remember the tide pulling in without warning. Iris went cold. Because she did. Not the wave, but the silence before it. The way her father shouted not in panic, but warning. The way he pushed her toward the rocks. And how, when she turned, he was already gone. He was claimed, the widow said. By what? Not what. Who? She gestured toward the jars. Each of these was once a voice. A name spoken aloud. Then buried before it could become hollow. Before it could be rewritten. Iris backed toward the door. You're insane. But the door was gone. Behind her, only mist. Thick. Smelling of salt and old bones. You were supposed to leave Driftmouth, the widow said. I did. Then why are you here now? Because of the estate. No, her voice cracked like ice. You're here because you've started to remember. And the sea is listening. The jar with her father's name began to glow faintly. And inside it, something moved. Not just the lock of hair. A mouth. Pressed to the glass from within. Iris screamed. The widow touched the jar gently. It calmed. The mouth disappeared. The brine stilled. But the whisper remained in the air. We only drown what's already forgetting. You buried these, Iris said. Why? To keep them safe. From what? The widow looked toward the black window, where no light entered. From the part of the sea that speaks in your voice. The floor trembled. A low sound, like the grinding of stone against flesh. Outside, gulls screamed. Inside, the other jars began to glow. Each with a name. Some Iris knew. Some she had almost been. One was blank. Unlabeled. Sealed. And already cracked. The widow reached for the coral knife. Handed it to Iris. Take it. I'm not cutting anything. You're not meant to. You're meant to choose. Choose what? The widow stepped back. Let the question hang like smoke. Then she whispered. Who you let come back. That night, Iris didn't go home. She slept, if you could call it sleep, on the widow's floor. The jars around her pulsed faintly, like breath. Each one a different memory. And in her dreams, the sea stood upright, tall as a cathedral, covered in eyes, with a door in its chest. And behind the door, her father's voice, singing lullabies in reverse. At 3:33 a.m., she woke, the coral knife in her hand, the jar beside her pillow, the label gone, replaced with a word that hadn't existed yesterday. Iris. She almost dropped it, but the widow appeared beside her. Come. Silent. And said, Now you see. It was never about your father. It was about what he gave the sea instead of you. Iris stood at the cliff's edge. The jar labeled with her name pulsed faintly in her coat pocket, emitting a low warmth that curled around her spine like smoke. Behind her, the salt widow's house, quiet, with no candle in the window. Before her, the sea. But not the one she remembered. This water didn't move with waves. It watched. A surface smooth as polished stone, stretching black and perfect into the horizon. And something beneath it waited. She pulled the jar from her pocket. Its crack had widened. Inside, the brine bubbled gently, and within that liquid, a second pair of eyes. Not reflected. Internal. They blinked. And then she heard it. Her own voice, not as memory, but as question. Why were you allowed to stay above, when I sank carrying your name? The salt air thickened. The cliffs moaned. And the wind brought with it a sound like weeping through a conch shell. Iris turned away. She wanted to throw the jar, cast it far into the ocean and be done. But the widow's voice returned, inside her mind now. If you discard the sea's offering, it does not forget. It replaces. And what bears your name will come walking, with your face, from the shore. Back at the widow's house, the other jars had changed. Now they hummed in harmony, a deep, droning chord like a choir buried 6 feet under. The widow had etched a symbol into her floor, a spiral with sharp barbs turning inward. In its center, a bowl of sea glass teeth. Everything you've forgotten, she said, not looking up, is still alive. Iris dropped the jar on the floor. It didn't break. It rolled to the spiral. And stopped. Right at the center. You said my father gave something else to the sea, Iris whispered. The widow nodded. He gave you. But not all of you. Just the part you tried to kill. What part? The one that never stopped screaming under the water. That night, Iris dreamed again. This time, she wasn't a child. She was underwater. Still breathing. And across from her in the deep, a version of herself. Hair floating like ink. Lips blue. Skin pale as salt bone. But smiling. And in her hand, a second coral knife. She mouthed the words. Come down and be whole. She woke in her aunt's house, the one she had sworn not to sleep in again. But this time, something waited in the mirror. Not her reflection, but her double from the dream. Dry now, dressed in white, holding her jar. And behind her, the sea, filling the reflection, crashing against the walls of the room. You buried me when you said you forgot. But names rot slower in salt. The mirror cracked, but didn't shatter, only opened. And from it came cold. A breeze smelling of kelp and grief. And footsteps. Iris turned, and no one was there. But wet footprints led from the mirror to the hall, to the staircase, to the locked attic, which now stood ajar. And from within, a lullaby she hadn't heard since she was 5. The tide is wide, the child inside. The waves will hush, the breath will bide. She climbed slowly, the air thick, the wood slick with salt. Inside the attic, a single trunk, bound in rope, marked with a symbol identical to the spiral carved in the widow's floor. Her hands moved before she could think. Undid the knot, lifted the lid. Inside, herself. Not a body. A bundle. A tooth. A locket with her baby picture. A letter in her father's handwriting. To the part of her that could not survive above. May she sleep beneath until I am called. Iris screamed. The attic door slammed behind her. And from the walls came the sound of every jar in the widow's house shattering at once. Except hers. Hers remained. And it began to leak. Dark brine spilling across the attic floor, running upward like ink in reverse. And in the pool, a hand, pale, salt-pickled, wearing her fingerprint like a glove. The attic floor was drowning. Not flooding, drowning. The brine from the jar oozed upward, defying gravity, curling along the wood beams like veins finding a forgotten heart. And in its center, the hand waited. It wasn't just pale. It was empty, as though it had once held something vital and been drained by centuries of grief. The fingers curled slowly, and pointed to Iris. She couldn't move. Her breath stayed in her throat like it no longer belonged to her. The hand rose higher. Then a second followed. Then shoulders. A neck. And finally, her face. But wrong. This Iris was not from any dream. She had eyes that stared with no memory behind them, hair that moved as if underwater, and lips that moved in perfect synchronization with Iris's own, but said different words. You sealed me, and the sea wrote my name with your mouth. So I came back to collect it. The attic trembled, not from weight, but from resonance. A sound rising beneath the house, vibrating through the salt in the floor, the knots in the wood, the marrow in her bones. She stumbled back. The mirror in the corner cracked. It showed not her, not the attic, but the cliffs. And on them, the Salt Widow, ringing a bell made of teeth. One for each name returned. Iris screamed. But the sound that left her throat wasn't hers. It was the doppelganger's voice. Low, wet, ancient. A sound that should never have echoed on land. And the thing smiled. Because now it had her name. And she was becoming the silence left behind. She reached for the coral knife. But it was gone. In its place, only a spiral burned into the attic floor. Her name at its center, letter by letter reversing. Iris Siri. Until it vanished altogether. Downstairs, the front door blew open. Not from wind, but from the absence of resistance. The house had surrendered. The sea was inside. It poured down the chimney, up through the drains, between the cracks of old windows that had never opened before. And with it, dozens of names. Each whispered as they passed. Each a jar that had broken. Each a person forgotten. The attic dissolved. The house breathed once, deep, slow, final. And then it collapsed inward. Not exploded. Folded. Like it had never been built, only spoken. In the morning, there was no structure on Driftmouth Cliffs. Only a ring of jars half buried in salt-white sand. One still sealed. One warm. And labeled. The Salt Widow. The villagers never spoke her name again. The children no longer ran past the gate, because there was no gate. Only a bell that tolled when the fog came in. And sometimes, just before the tide turned red with memory, they swore they saw a woman in black lace walking into the sea. Her face blurred by the waves. Her name already forgotten. But her voice, still calling, for you.